Welcome to Embargoed, a podcast featuring intelligent talk about sanctions, export controls, and all things international trade for trade nerds and normal human beings alike. I am one of your hosts, Brian Fleming. I am here, as always, with my friend, colleague, and co-host, Mr. Timothy O'Toole. What is up, Tim, on this lovely spring Monday morning? How are you?
I'm very good, Brian. It's the day after Easter for those of you who celebrate Easter. It's beautiful Easter Monday. I think it's a holiday in a lot of the world as well.
It is indeed. It is indeed. Also, Passover has just concluded as well. So, for
Exactly.
those who celebrate Passover, happy. So, yes, happy Monday, happy spring, happy holidays if this is a holiday weekend for you. Welcome back to Embargoed. Thank you for joining again. We have an interesting episode this week. I think, as typically occurs at sort of the last moment, we had some late breaking news that we're going to have to tackle sort of right away. So that's we've kind of re-engineered the outline, the agenda for this week to accommodate that as we have to do quite often these days. So why don't we just get right to it? I think so just with the normal upfront comments that we're not giving legal advice, we're not sharing any confidential information, and in all opinions on this program are mine or Tim's. If you don't like them, they are solely our fault. And if you are a fan of the pod, please subscribe. You can find us anywhere you get your podcast content. Please give us a rating, hopefully a 5-star rating. And please keep comments, feedback, questions, topic suggestions coming. We do appreciate that. And without further ado, I'm going to jump right into the roadmap. So we have one big topic that I alluded to already that we're going to cover at the top, which I think is going to be will be a fairly meaty, substantive discussion about the talks that are starting this week in Vienna relating to having the U.S. come back into the JCPOA, what we've been calling JCPOA 2.0. So obviously is of major significance, and we're going to spend some time talking about that at the top. And then we are going to proceed to cover the remainder of the topics in lightning round fashion. We had planned to do an all lightning round program, but I think JCPOA 2.0 kind of upended that. So after that, we're going to cover Hong Kong and China. We're going to cover Burma again, Belarus, the ICC, potentially for the last time, and a recent OFAC settlement with Nordgas. And that'll be our program for today. So anything, Tim, before we launch in, or are we ready to roll here?
No, I think we've been waiting for JCPOA 2.0 for a while, and there have been some steps toward it, but I'm excited to talk about what looks like the first major step towards JCPOA 2.0.
Yeah, so why don't we jump right in? So that's obviously, as I just said, topic number one is the talks that are going to commence this week in Vienna, I believe tomorrow. Today we're recording this on Monday, April 5th. And so this just came about at the very end of last week. There was a meeting held between all of the JCPOA, the original JCPOA participants, the Joint Commission, and without the U.S. to discuss the prospect of the U.S. coming back into the deal, and the flip side of that coin being Iran coming back into compliance with their obligations as well. And what has been decided is that, and that obviously all parties have been sort of dancing around this for the past few months, as we have talked about extensively. The Biden administration has signaled that they are highly interested in getting back into the deal, uh, assuming that Iran will get back into compliance on their end of the deal. And so there have been some preliminary back and forth and signaling and indirect messages being passed. And now we finally, it seems, have some talks that are starting, albeit indirect talks. And that is important to note that it is not as if, for those who are not following this closely, the U.S. and the Iranians are not going to be sitting across the table from one another in Vienna. They are going to be essentially, this is the way that mediations work, is you go off in your separate groups, and there'll be a group working with the U.S. and a group working with the Iranians, is the way it's been reported. And there's a hope that they will come to some common ground in terms of what each side feels that they need or want or is willing to give in order to really kind of relaunch the talks in earnest to get a deal back on track and to get everybody back into the deal. A few things just to note quickly at the outset before I sort of throw this back to Tim. And I think as you may expect, there's a lot of questions that now flow from this, which is I think what we want to spend the bulk of our time talking about, is doing as we like to do, doing some prognosticating and some brainstorming about what we think we're likely to see here over the next weeks and months. And the one thing that is working in terms of the clock on this is that the Iranians have an election coming up in June. And I think conventional wisdom and most of the policy experts who scrutinize this closely think that there is going to be high motivation on the Iranian side to get something agreed to and done before the election, so that for a few reasons. One is to show some progress and hopefully either be able to demonstrate that sanctions have already been eased to some degree and more may be coming, and to be able to credibly claim a win for the Iranian side perhaps before the election. Obviously, there's also just that sort of potential chaos that could ensue if if the election results turn out to sort of flip control of the government and there's an entirely new team and perspective could be coming to the table by the summertime. So that's also a bit of an urgent matter on the U.S. side. Obviously, with the Biden administration still very fresh, with still a lot of resistance to this deal in Congress and in other pockets of the government. They need to kind of tread carefully here to not be appearing to give up too much, I think, to get back into this deal. That being said, I saw a quote from a senior administration official, although not attributed, but certainly an on-the-record quote that said, "Look, maximum pressure under the Trump administration just didn't work. And we think that it's time to sort of jettison that approach and to rethink what we had started, several years ago under the Obama administration, which is this deal and moving toward a non-nuclear Iran and perhaps seeing what can be changed and modified to improve the deal from our perspective and from perhaps everybody's perspective." And so that I think is where things stand at the moment. And of course, the first big question for you, Mr. O'Toole, is, so number one, what are your reactions? And number two, thinking about what has been, there was a lot of discussion about what was trying to be sorted out here is what are some initial mutual steps that we could see from the U.S. and from Iran that are going to lead us back into a deal that may still be coming. And obviously, on the U.S. side, I think it would be sanctions relief. On the Iranian side, it would be, are they going to stop enriching uranium at the rate that they are currently doing so, and working on centrifuges and other things that are of concern that are clearly not consistent with their obligations under the deal, the original deal. But now there's also some suggestion that perhaps the both sides are willing to just kind of jump ahead a bit and sort of say, well, what is a deal? What is JCPOA 2.0 really going to look like? Let's just get down to it and figure out at a high level, what is this all going to look like? And obviously, even with the time pressures that I just outlined, this is going to take some time. I can't imagine this is all going to come together in a matter of weeks. This is going to be months in all likelihood. But that being said, it's not out of the realm of possibility that there could be some broad understanding at a high level of what a deal might look like in the next few months, and then it'll take a little while to kind of get the details hammered out thereafter. So let me stop there and throw it to you. What are your initial impressions about what's being reported, and what do you expect to see in the short term?
So I guess my first impression is that the politics here is important for both sides. So on the one hand, I think from the U.S. side, um, President Biden does not want to look like he's giving in to the Iranians, and certainly not giving in to the Iranians when they are not in compliance with their nuclear obligations. Now, from the Iranians' perspective, they were in compliance with their nuclear obligations when the U.S. was in the deal, and they only went out of compliance with them when the U.S. left the deal. So I think they would debate, how much at fault they are for not being in compliance with those obligations. But nonetheless, I think from the U.S. side, President Biden doesn't want to go first because he wants the Iranians to commit first to returning to compliance with their nuclear obligations, which was the premise of the deal. So that politics are important from the US side. From the Iranian side, I think it is important for the current government with the elections upcoming to show that it can get sanctions relief, that the economy, I mean, Iran, like the US and like many other countries, was hit very hard by COVID-19. And the economy took that plus the sanctions hit. And I think that the current government needs to show some progress and some quick progress, and getting sanctions relief would be a big boon to them. And so the real question in my mind on the politics is, that all of that is really pushing towards a quick deal. On the other hand, it's unlikely that anything really quick can happen, in part because kind of my second impression is really that the obstacles that the Republicans generally, but President Trump at the end of his term, put in the way to returning to the JCPOA are real. And what I mean by that is, so President Trump at the end of his term imposed all sorts of new sanctions well beyond those that were in existence and that were covered by JCPOA 1.0. And so when you're trying to go back into the JCPOA, you can't just jump right back into it, because which sanctions get lifted, which new sanctions get lifted? Presumably all of them. I mean, I think that's probably the operating premise, but the JCPOA didn't address some of the sanctions that were there, and it was very detailed about what you did with particular sanctions, and who came off lists and that sort of thing. So there's going to be a lot of work to be done to address those sanctions. It's not going to be just like they could just slip the JCPOA back into place, because it was too specific about which sanctions were lifted, and there's lots of new sanctions that it couldn't have taken into account at the time because they didn't exist at the time. The other thing that I think, opposition to the deal on the U.S. side was in part based on the fact that it was it was a temporary deal. It was only 10 years, and it's being portrayed in the media now, I think correctly, as very tough measures on the nuclear side, but in exchange for temporary sanctions relief. I mean, now it's down to 4 years. I mean, the JCPOA was signed in 2015, and I think the obligations expire in 2025. Do you go back into the deal for only a 4-year commitment is a really, I think, tough question. And from a kind of an optics standpoint, I really see it being difficult for the Biden administration to essentially sign an agreement that expires in only 4 years and lift the sanctions in the process. And so I think there's going to have to be some discussion about whether you make those sanctions, or whether you make the agreement, longer term. Do you make it permanent? I mean, how do you deal with the timing issue is really another concern. And I guess the third impression is, and this is kind of from looking at related news, is that, I think we said, when the U.S. withdrew from the JCPOA, not on the podcast because there wasn't a podcast yet, but we were out and about. I think we were over in the Far East talking about the JCPOA when the U.S. withdrew from it, and we said at the time that China would be the big winner in this. And China is signing trade treaties with Iran as we speak, and has been engaging in oil trade with Iran, potentially sanctionable, but oil trade with Iran throughout the U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA. I do think that really changes the dynamic of the JCPOA. I mean, I think the Iranians need it from a political perspective because the sanctions have hurt their economy, but they don't need it as much as they might have before, because China is becoming a bigger and bigger trade partner with Iran. And so I think China's rise in connection with Iran trade is really going to affect the dynamic of these negotiations and how much Iran is willing to give up to get either more sanctions relief or just the sanctions relief in the JCPOA.
Yeah, just a couple things. So the restrictions under the JCPOA originally that would apply to Iran, some of them are 10 years, some of them are 15 years. So it depends. So there are some that would be a little longer term, even if they were unaltered and we just went back to the original. But I agree with you. I think that given that there's kind of an ability to reset a bit and rethink, I think that is clearly what's going to happen, is that a lot of this is going to be rethought. And not not surprisingly, I would imagine the Iranians and the Europeans, quite frankly, who were livid when the US pulled out of the deal in 2018, are going to want some assurances and some other, leverage perhaps against the U.S. that if 4 years from now or 5 years from now we're under we have a Trump acolyte that's in the White House who is going to come back and say, no, the second deal was even worse than the first deal. I'm pulling us out again. Then there's no, we're kind of in boy who cried wolf territory here, and there needs to, I would imagine, be some legitimate assurances that that's not going to happen again. So I think that is a significant complicating factor you have to keep in mind as well. And then to the second point you made about China, which I think is a very good one, let's keep in mind though that is not going to tell the whole story in terms of the Europeans, because as we know, the Europeans are more closely aligned with even though there's the blocking statute and all the other things are in place now to sort of formally, rebuke the U.S. approach to secondary sanctions with respect to Iran. As we know very well from our clients and from all of the issues we deal with on this front, the Europeans are pretty well aligned with the US in that they're not going near Iran at the moment because they're too fearful of being cut off from the US financial system. And so, unless or until there is meaningful sanctions relief, that's not going to change. And even if that sanctions relief comes, as part of this 2.0 deal, I think the point I just made about people being a bit gun shy about jumping back in is going to be a real barrier here for a little while. I mean, they were many companies who were, I think, inclined to get back into the Iranian market or to explore the Iranian market for the first time in 2016 were gun shy at that point because they were a little worried about how this was all going to play out. And then obviously that turned out to be, because of the U.S. pulling out 2.5 years later, I mean, that turned out to be a bit of a disaster, and at a minimum, just a huge logistical and compliance headache for everybody to deal with, even if it didn't sort of create any, kind of wounds that lasted any longer than that. And so I think if we're looking at another go round of this, there's going to be some real soul searching. Now, as we know, if companies think there's money to be made legally, they're going to weigh the risks and they're going to decide whether they can live with that or not. And so I think that there's going to be a lot of that. I just think it's just going to be that much more complex and that much murkier at this point. And I think in in the short term, I think you're right. I think the assumption has to be that we're going to revert to a position that is pretty similar to where we were pre 2018, where all of the sanctions that have been lifted via JCPOA 1.0 are gone, and everything that was additional that was added in the last 2+ years is also going to be gone eventually. I don't know what the phasing of that's going to look like. I don't know if some of that comes off sooner or later or how they're going to sequence that, but you have to assume that's probably where we're going. But I think, again, half the battle when you lift secondary sanctions is convincing those people that are in the crosshairs potentially for those sanctions that they're safe to pursue these opportunities. And I think that is going to be a much trickier thing to do, I think, the second time around.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's got to be, and I don't know how you do it, and the politics may be difficult, but I think there's got to be some type of withdrawal only for cause mechanism that is put into these deals, that where essentially you're in unless you can show cause that somebody is violating the agreement, and that will allow you to get out of the agreement, and maybe some sort of monetary penalty for early withdrawal that's significant enough that it'll stop anybody from withdrawing from this, because the deal doesn't really work if companies feel like it could change any minute, because there is, as we know, a lot of investment that needs to be put in to get into the Iran business, because the companies that do this, especially if the JCPOA 2.0 is like 1.0 in the sense that the U.S. sanctions, the primary sanctions that apply to U.S. persons against Iran, don't get lifted. If they don't get lifted, which I find it shocking if they would, if lifting the primary sanctions was part of any new deal. Assuming that that's the case, any European company that wants to go into Iran is going to have to expend substantial resources, not just developing a network in Iran and doing all the things that you have to do to get into a particular country, which are expensive in and of themselves, but the compliance costs are going to be relatively large because you have to make sure that you're only doing business in Iran in a way that doesn't involve a U.S. nexus that could get you sanctioned. And so, who is gonna go to that sort of effort again when you have an example 3 years before of one party just unilaterally withdrawing because the politics change? It seems like the idea that this would work is really only viable if there's some sort of serious mechanism that prevents without cause unilateral withdrawal. And I don't know how you do
I
it, but
mean,
I think it's got to be
yeah, I
unilateral.
mean, I think in theory that makes sense, but I can't imagine the U.S. ever signing up to something that would be punitive and potentially against their interests if there was some, for policy reasons, there was some reason that they would want to withdraw again. And maybe that's the catch, right? Or there's the rub. But at the same time, this was always going to be, it was going to rise and fall on sort of the good faith of all of the parties involved, right? And there was going to have to, and again, the, 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 the problem or the way that this was forecast originally was there's got to be mechanisms to ensure that the Iranians are keeping up their end of the deal. And the idea that one of the other parties would unilaterally withdraw was not really in anybody's mind, and now here we are, and now that's an extra complication that needs to be sorted out. So we'll have to see. I don't know. It'll be fascinating to see how this plays out over the next couple months. One other thing, maybe one last thing that I want to throw out to you to contemplate here. We still hear a lot from companies that they have some opportunity that comes up that's maybe an indirect, business in Iran or some kind of Iranian connection that's coming up. Some of these they just kind of come up in the normal course of business, right? They're not necessarily looking for these. They come up, and then the question quickly turns to, well, what is the secondary sanctions risk? What is my risk here of being subject to blocking sanctions or perhaps one of the lesser sanctions depending on the circumstances? And one thing that I know that I recall sort of clearly from the lead up to JCPOA 1.0 is that there was, I think, a general understanding and feeling that the U.S. was not going to, in order to sort of keep the good faith negotiation ongoing, they were not going to be aggressively pursuing folks via secondary sanctions during the run up to signing a deal, because if these things are going to go away, then you sort of you can't have it both ways. You can't be crushing people left and right for engaging in sanctionable conduct that's covered by the secondary sanctions that are only back in place because we pulled out of the deal, and then trying to negotiate a new sort of a version 2.0 at the same time. So I guess my question is just and obviously the caveat to this is it all depends. It depends on the circumstances. It depends on the industry you're talking about. It depends on a lot of different things. It depends on the counterparties. But what do you think to companies out there that are starting to think along those lines, which is, oh, maybe that deal that I thought was risky 6 months ago or a year ago, maybe it's not as risky now if I wanted to revisit that. Uh, Again, we're not giving legal advice. If you have real questions about this, you have to please call us offline. But just as a general matter, I think this is an interesting one because I think that we're coming into that zone where there's likely to be lighter enforcement when it comes to those. And we haven't seen a ton of enforcement in the secondary sanctions realm anyway. It's there as a deterrent and it works as a deterrent, we know. But the idea that companies are going to be sort of factoring this in now, at least for the foreseeable future, before we have clear guidance on what's next. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting question for companies because, as you pointed out, Brian, the enforcement risk, even during the maximum pressure times, was pretty low, particularly for European c- uh, companies that were not engaging in the oil sector. So I can't really think of any examples of companies that got sanctioned for doing any of that business, and yet Iran was selling at least some oil during that whole time period. And so you know I tend to think that if you're making a risk-based decision as a company as to the likelihood of enforcement of secondary sanctions under the Biden administration, which is actively trying to repair relations with European countries and its European partners in NATO, which is now about to start engaging in indirect talks to go back into the nuclear deal where secondary sanctions are lifted. As a practical matter, not giving legal advice, but as a practical matter, you could make a decision that the enforcement risks are very low. That said, they're not going to be zero until the sanctions are lifted. And the problem is that although the chances of any one company getting hit are small, that if they do get hit, it's basically a death sentence for a company that relies on the U.S. financial system. And so it's like how risk averse are you? If you like to let it ride on the on the 11, then go for it. But it is because I do think that the enforcement risks are very small right now for pure secondary sanctions violations. But
Yeah, but you
I wouldn't
already
want to do it if it was my company.
right, and as you already pointed out, I think there there seems to be a very low likelihood that we're getting rid of more than just the secondary sanctions. I think we might be back in line with kind of where we were again 4 years ago during the beginning of the JCPOA implementation the first time around. And if that's the case, even if you can operate, even if you're a totally non-U.S. business, so you're based outside the US and you're employing non-US people by and large, you're still running the risk that you could involve a US person, whether it's one of your own people, an agent, a bank, etc. And then all of a sudden you're still looking at big penalties potentially. So it's not as if your compliance it's not as if your compliance issues go to zero or go away. They don't, and they probably never will with Iran, at least not in our lifetime as things are going. But I think it is an interesting question to sort of entertain, and I think we have a sense that companies are starting to entertain that now as these talks are actually starting to happen, and the prospect of a 2.0 version of the deal becomes a bit more real.
Yeah, I mean, just a final thought on that, and we'll actually circle back to it at the end. But I mean, it is going to be complicated for companies to make this decision on the fly, because while they can say we're willing to take a secondary sanctions risk, a lot of companies don't quite understand what a secondary sanction is. And so, as we'll see at the very end of the lightning round, I mean, there's a company in Italy that's just got in big trouble a couple of weeks ago for trading with Iran, but from Italy. And I think from their perspective, and OFAC even seems to suggest that in the settlement agreement, they didn't really get that by selling from Italy to Iran, that they were creating a primary sanctions risk, but it was U.S. origin goods. And so they probably got it given some of the things in the other facts in the discussion, which we'll get to, but nonetheless, I mean, OFAC recognized there that there's a lot of misinformation about when the primary sanctions apply, and just having U.S. origin goods that are re-exported to Iran apply, and those won't be affected at all by the JCPOA. So there'll still be a lot of risk for European companies, even the ones that know what they're doing after the JCPOA. But there's a lot of misinformation out there. I mean, that's been my experience. I know it's been your experience over in Europe about when the Iran sanctions will apply in the first place. And so as I said, I think the likelihood of a secondary sanctions enforcement action against a European company for doing business in Iran while the new JCPOA is being negotiated are pretty low, especially outside of oil. But I still wouldn't do it. And I think it'd be crazy risky for a European company to just make that decision kind of on the fly without a real examination of what their risks are.
Right. Okay, so we'll leave things there for now. That's obviously an item we're going to monitor very closely. I'm sure we will be back on this before too long as potentially the indirect talks turn to direct talks and we get more information to help us understand what this may all look like and what the implications are going to be for companies around the world. But we'll leave it there. And that is the only, as I said, the only sort of full topic we're going to cover today. Now, the rest of the program we're going to cover in, wait for the sound effect, lightning round fashion. So with that, let me toss it back to Tim, and let's take um, a quick glimpse at what just came out from the State Department on Hong Kong.
Absolutely. We've talked about this a few times, but under the U.S. Hong Kong Policy Act of 1992, the Secretary of State is supposed to report every year about what the status is of Hong Kong's autonomy that is guaranteed under the agreement with the UK that essentially turned Hong Kong back over to the Chinese government. And so on March 31st, Secretary Blinken submitted the first report from the Biden administration on this issue. And the Secretary of State is also required to certify essentially up or down as to whether Hong Kong's status warrants differential treatment under U.S. law from China. And essentially, that is a determination of whether or not Hong Kong is sufficiently autonomous such that the U.S. will treat it differently for export control purposes and for a number of other trade purposes. The Trump administration answered that question no, and I think on the pod we have talked about, what would the Biden administration, what view would the Biden administration take with respect to Hong Kong? And our view was that it would probably take a very similar position. And when you read through the report that came out at the end of March, I think that was perfectly confirmed. This report could have been written in some sense by the Trump administration in terms of the tone and the viewpoint. I mean, it's a very professional report, but it is really very scathing in terms of the PRC and in terms of Hong Kong's not getting the promised degree of autonomy. I mean, it goes through and it highlights various actions that the Chinese national security law has various effects that law has had on Hong Kong's autonomy. Talks about arbitrary arrests, politically motivated prosecutions of opposition politicians, activists, peaceful protesters. It really is, as I said, relatively scathing, a de facto ban on public demonstrations, and so it Secretary Blinken certified that Hong Kong is not sufficiently autonomous to be treated differently, and that was exactly the position of the Trump administration. So, in that sense, nothing has changed. That determination has trade consequences, but I think it also sends a signal that the sanctions program that relates to Hong Kong autonomy is probably not going anywhere anytime soon.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add other than, yeah, newsflash, Hong Kong is still part of the PRC as far as the United States is concerned. Not surprising, as Tim has said. I think what's somewhat interesting here, and again, this is another topic that we've talked about a lot, is in some ways, I think when from the time when the national security law was passed last year, targeting Hong Kong to now, and with all of the news reports that have come out, delays in the elections, cracking down on public demonstrations, on opposition party leaders, on other things of that sort. Um, there certainly China is not not only is China not backing down or being cowed whatsoever by the fact that the US has decided to take this step and to impose sanctions on some of the people involved in this conduct. They have in some ways almost relish the opportunity to sort of come hard at this issue and to deal with it. Again, they maintain it's a purely internal domestic issue, as they do with Xinjiang, which is another area that continues to grow worse and worse and get more and more kind of public scrutiny. And now there are many different companies that are kind of in the crosshairs there that are taking sides and that are being called out by China or by the US and people outside of China who have human rights concerns. And I think this I think goes back to a question that we have posed a number of times, which is, what is the goal of the sanctions program here? What are we hoping to actually accomplish? Because one could argue that we're exacerbating the situation, perhaps. Now, one could also argue that from a symbolic and moral and political standpoint, we have to do something. So we are doing what we can to impose sanctions on the people that are responsible here, and same with Xinjiang. But again, what is the end game? What is actually going to potentially change behavior? And I don't know what the answers to those questions are, and I don't know that anybody really knows. But that's kind of where we find ourselves now with Hong Kong and Xinjiang in particular. And I think there are going to be, again, Taiwan, South China Sea. There are other issues with respect to China where we're going to see the same kind of thing bubble up and the same kind of response in all likelihood from the PRC. And so all I do is kind of throw that out there as kind of food for thought, and to, as Tim said, this is not the sanctions program is not going away, in part because it's not really doing much right now other than causing some individual pain for the people that have been put on the list perhaps. And if there's a change in approach, or if we kind of steadily just keep this very, these individual designations going, and see what that yields, I don't know, but that's really, that's sort of what springs to mind here for me.
Well, I mean, this is, the one point I just wanted to chime in on, because I think it's a really great point, is that this does show why you really need to think long and hard before imposing sanctions in the first place, or setting up a sanctions program in the first place. Because
That's going to be a
what
theme through this episode for the next couple of topics, by the
Right.
way.
I mean, because what do you hope to, one of the, at least theoretically, when you're theoretically thinking about where sanctions, work best, usually with an economy that is close to the size of yours, and that has, that is also open to the world, um, the chances of sanctions doing much are very small, because the Chinese economy is just too big. It has too many trading partners. It's really going. It's always going to be hard to impose sanctions and have them be effective against an economy that large. And so you have to think long and hard about whether that is the right approach. I guess one other reason that you have to think about that your comment made me think about, is once you impose a sanctions program, especially if it's for a really good cause. So, for example, I don't think there's almost any dispute along all of the ideological spectrum in the United States that what the Chinese are doing in Hong Kong is very problematic for a variety of reasons, including the cancellation of an election for COVID reasons, when we had an election here where during COVID, when the outbreak was just as bad. I mean, it was just certainly, and probably
It
much
was worse here.
worse.
It was
Yeah.
worse here in the U.S. Yeah.
And so like all of the things that the Chinese were doing are not really defensible in Hong Kong, at least from a U.S. perspective, and that is not a left or right issue. So there's no dispute here that this is bad. Once you when you impose sanctions for that, there's really politically no way to lift them, because it's going to look like you're condoning what's going on in Hong Kong. So that's why it's another reason why it's so important to determine, whether or not they're worth imposing in the first place. And another problem with I think the Trump maximum pressure philosophy was, sanctions have no cost, and so we're going to just impose them every time we're upset about a foreign policy issue. And again, we'll talk later in the segment about whether they are reversible, because sometimes they are, but they're very hard to reverse in situations where everyone agrees going in that there is a real problem here, and everybody agrees on kind of who the culprit is, because you can't look soft by lifting the sanctions against the culprit without sending a message that we don't really care about Hong Kong. So I'm not advocating for lifting them, but once you decide to go down that road, you certainly have a hard time ever coming to the conclusion that they're not worth it.
Yeah, and again, just to wrap up here, I mean, perhaps the symbolic value of this is enough at this point, perhaps, and perhaps we're willing to deal with the collateral consequences of that in terms of angering the Chinese, to make a point, make a statement, take a moral stand on this issue. That might be enough, honestly, and the practical benefits are, it seems, minimal at the moment, but that might be enough. So in any event, that's sort of a big picture item that I think we'll come back to again. But on this front in particular, I think it's really it's really a notable aspect of it that I think needs to be thought about and considered. So with that, let's move to lightning round topic number two, which is Burma. And here too, I think we're dealing with some of those same types of issues we talked quite a bit about since the executive order came into place shortly after the coup. What is the end game here for the U.S.? What is the strategy? How aggressively are they going? Is the U.S. going to pursue sanctions? Well, a little less than 2 weeks ago, there was a new, and of course, the backdrop here is that things continue to get worse, that the conditions continue to be worse, that the violence perpetrated by the military continues to persist, and it is really pretty disheartening to see the news coming out of Burma these days. But a little less than
It
two
is
weeks ago,
grim. I would say
yeah,
grim is a good word for it
I
because
think
it
that's
just
not an
looks
over.
awful.
Yeah, that's not an overstatement. And so, a little less than 2 weeks ago, we had two additions to the SDN list under 14014, the Burma EO, and those were pretty big ones. This is the two military holding companies that we've alluded to previously. This is Myanmar Economic Holdings Public Company Limited, MEHL, and Myanmar Economic Corporation Limited, MEC. They were both added to the SDN list on March 25th. And this is significant to some degree because they cover a huge swath of the economy. MEHL is involved in banking, trade, logistics, construction, mining, tourism, consumables. MEC is a similar array of industries that they're involved in as well. And as reported and as stated in all of the public statements and the press release that accompany the designations, this is money that goes straight into the pockets of the military leadership. And so it's clear the reasons why these two companies, these two conglomerates would be targeted. Now, the knock-on effects of this, the secondary effects, hard to calculate because I think there's in all likelihood going to be some pain felt by the Burmese people, by the populace of Myanmar here because of how broad these conglomerates operate in the industries that they operate in, and given that there was a GL, there was a general license that was issued, General License 4, that allowed for wind down activities with these companies in their 50% or more owned subsidiaries through June 22nd. So there's quite a bit of time on the wind down front, but we know certainly from the questions we're getting and the conversations we're having, I think more and more companies, more and more interests are thinking about having to pick up and just leave Burma behind and treat it again as it was treated, 10 years ago, when before there was some move toward democratization, and it's kind of a sad state of affairs. But I think in the incremental progression of what the U.S. has trying to do here, this seemed to be the logical next step. I think we could see more entities like this that kind of play similar roles in terms of generating revenue for the military. I wouldn't be surprised if we see more of that. I don't think we're going to see maximum pressure again. I still don't think we're going to see that, as we've said, and as this administration has kind of dismissed as being an effective strategy, because for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is the toll it takes on the civilian population in the country. But I do think that this as the trend continues to uh, get worse and worse on the ground there. I think there will be more and more of these types of actions, and I think as a result, we're going to see more and more companies have to make decisions about whether they can continue to do business in Myanmar. And I think that's going to be some have already, I know, made the decision that they're going to be treating them, they're pulling out altogether. But I think this is a rapidly evolving situation. A lot of companies are having to wrestle with this right now.
Yeah, I mean, the situation there is grim because apparently the generals have decided to kind of come out from behind the screen again and seize power. Um, it is, I find it astounding. I mean, we knew this beforehand, but this designation has caused me to look at it more closely. That the generals, having ruled there for 40 years, have used part of their rule to acquire these huge economic conglomerates who's are then owned by the Myanmar military and pay dividends and salaries to high level Myanmar military leaders. I mean, this is not a secret. And so these are the company. To me, that is just the level of corruption that it suggests is pretty shocking. But it does allow for a pretty effective sanctions tool, because if you own these big companies, they can be the top target of designation, and you'll just be punishing the generals, at least mostly be punishing the generals, as opposed to the sort of embargoes that take place in Iran or Cuba, where you're punishing everybody because the whole country is essentially off limits as opposed to particularly targeted industries. Now, how much effect that will have remains to be seen. It could be quite a bit. I mean, Burma is a smaller economy, obviously, than China. It's the type of country where sanctions can work, and in fact, arguably did work in the past. The last time around, when the U.S. and other countries sanctioned Burma to the point where the military, at least for a little while, was willing to hand over power to a civilian government. So we'll see if they work here. They do have a better chance than, in my view, than the sanctions against a country like China, where the idea that the U.S. is going to sanction China into submission on any of these issues just does not seem very realistic to me.
All right. So from Burma, let's transition to lightning round topic number three, which is one we don't touch on often, Belarus, and I'm going to throw back to Tim for that one.
I think this may be our first foray into the Belarus sanctions program on embargo. We might have had a
It may
trivia
be.
question
It may
on it
be.
once, but apart from that, I don't think we go there much. But Belarus was sanctioned for human rights violations. One asked in the past, there is still a Belarus sanctions program. It has been relatively dormant, in part because Belarus was making progress on human rights issues, at least from the view of the State Department, and had made such progress that in 2015, the OFAC issued a general license for 9 state-owned industries in Belarus that were on the SDN list, but it was basically a general license that said, don't worry, if they're on the SDN list, you can do anything that you normally could do with these companies and treat them as though they're not on the SDN list. So it was basically a general license that took out all of the effect of these companies being SDNs, and it's been extended annually until relatively recently, when it was extended, I think, for 2 years, maybe even 3. But it's set to expire in the end of this month, and April 26th, I think, is the date when it's set to expire. And so, because the situation has deteriorated, and I do want to emphasize that issue from the State Department's perspective. I mean, they called it arguably the worst point in Belarus history, with 300 political prisoners currently detained in Belarus. The State Department has decided that it is not going to recommend to Treasury that it reissue the general license, and essentially put these companies back on to the SDN list in not only continuing their listing there, but making that listing have the normal practical effect of an SDN listing. Now, oddly, or I guess probably there's a purpose here. They have not. Has been no decision yet not to renew the general license. So it's essentially states saying, we're going to recommend to Treasury this, but if you were to change your behavior, Belarus, in the next few weeks, we could reverse this step. And so, the State Department has now called on the Belarusian authorities to take the step of lifting these sorts of political human rights violations, and has outright said that that could affect the decision as to whether or not these companies the general license gets extended. So we'll have to wait and see, but I think it was an interesting step, and one that is, it seems like they're trying to use this GL as a carrot and to do it in advance so that they can try and get some effect out of it.
Yeah, this is an example where there is a clear plan here, which is we're going to leverage this general license, which impacts 9 state-owned petrochemical companies that are important to the Belarusian government, and make it clear that you're not going to get another 12 or 18 months of GL coverage unless you release all these political prisoners. And for those who weren't following, there was an election last year. The ruling party, the ruling president, who's been in control of the country for decades now, is largely thought to be fraudulent and rigged, and opposition party opponents were kept off the ballot, and people were prevented from voting, and all kinds of things. And so there were a handful of sanctions that were issued late last year under the Trump administration that were targeted at some of those activities, but this is obviously a broader swing to try to get some movement here and to get the release of these political prisoners and get some actual change in behavior. So we'll see. Again, it's a pretty targeted action, and they're on the clock. There's 3 weeks until this general license expires. So I think by the time we record our next episode, we'll know one way or the other whether it has been extended and reissued, or whether perhaps reissued only for a shorter length of time. I think it was 6 months originally, and then it had ballooned up to, the most recent was 18 months.
Yeah, it was
And
October
so,
2019 to
yeah, so it's
April 2021.
exactly. So it was about this one was covering 18 months, but seems unlikely that they'll get another 18 months given where things are now. But we'll see how that plays out. And obviously, this is pretty consequential for anybody who's got dealings with any of those companies, or more broadly with Belarus, because it could signal that there's going to be some increased scrutiny and activity there from a U.S. sanctions perspective. So,
Yeah, I mean,
uh,
very surgical use of the sanctions power here. We'll see if it works, but it is,
yeah.
they know what they want to do. They have one goal in mind. It's a country that they've found some, companies that are susceptible to sanctions and potentially could be very hurt by them, and they've used that as leverage. And that is, I think, textbook use of the sanctions power. Now, whether it will actually change behavior is remains to be seen. But I think that's the whole point: is they're trying to change a particular type of behavior, and they're using sanctions in a way that, in their view, has the most likely chance of doing it.
Yeah, surgical is a good description for it. I think that's exactly right. So with that, let's move on, and so we'll be back to check on that, I'm sure, in a few weeks once we come April 26th comes and goes. To that, let's go to lightning round topic number 4. Only 2 topics left, and this is one of our favorites. And like I said, this may be now the last time we talk about this one, which is the executive order targeting the ICC that we talked about quite extensively, most recently in the context of the lawsuit that was filed, where there was a preliminary injunction that was granted to the Open Society Justice Initiative and some lawyers who wanted to continue working with the ICC but felt that they couldn't under the current sanctions program. And on April 1, President Biden signed an executive order that rescinded and revoked the existing executive order 13928 that was put in place by President Trump last year. I think at the time, my prediction was this one might get issued and never used, and then it would go away under potentially a new administration. So I was wrong, but it did only get used for the 2 individuals, the prosecutor and the other high-level ICC official, who are now obviously no longer subject to sanctions. Those have been lifted by revocation of the executive order. And I think this is a move that's being applauded by allies, certainly all the signatories to the ICC, and other kind of international justice and human rights groups who saw the Trump executive order as being just completely counter to U.S. values when it comes to international criminal justice and human rights initiatives. I will say, though, and this was announced, Secretary Blinken made a big announcement about this on Friday about the revocation. But both in President Biden's statement accompanying the executive order and in Secretary Blinken's statement, they were quick to point out that they still don't agree with what the ICC is doing, particularly with respect to potentially investigating U.S. troops in Afghanistan and Israeli forces in Palestine, as those are kind of the two central events that sort of raised the ire of the Trump administration with respect to the ICC. So there is certainly no love lost, I think, with the ICC, but in keeping with perhaps more traditional approaches, I think they've signaled that sanctions is not going to be the way that we're going to try to deal with this. And I think that we brought this up at the time, and I think this was called out in some of the articles that were commenting on the revocation. When the U.S. is going to use sanctions to literally go after every foreign policy action anywhere around the world that it doesn't like, it's going to run the risk of just devaluing the tool and also encouraging copycat actors. They were citing China's recent actions to go after people in a similar regard, and basically saying the U.S. you gave China the idea to do this because once you do it, you have no moral high ground to claim that this is something that you shouldn't, nobody should be doing, and we should be respecting these institutions. So I think this is something that we've been focused on quite a bit. I think this administration is very sensitive to and is trying to sort of unwind as quickly as they can to preserve the credibility and the utility of the sanctions tool, certainly. And so there's kind of a lot in this, but again, and also I should add, there was a filing deadline in that Open Society Justice Initiative court action that was coming up this week. So I think the timing here is no accident. I think they didn't want to have to make a substantive filing in that case. They wanted to be able to say the case is moot because the executive order is now gone. And so that is, as we've seen in a couple of other instances, that these court deadlines can be big drivers to actually shift policy. So to any of you enterprising sorts out there who want to kick around these ideas or explore these ideas, I mean, we talk about this all the time. I think it's worth thinking about. If you do it in the right way, you can actually spur some action. So let me stop there and throw it to you, Tim. What are your sort of quick thoughts on the ICC EO going away?
So, I mean, I don't think I've been shy about this. I've thought all along this was a stupid sanctions program, a stupid executive order. It never should have been issued. It was a poor use of the sanctions tool for all the reasons that you just said, Brian, including the fact that, copycat actors who never wanted to comply with international norms at all can use it in their own right to resist much more traditional exercises of the ICC's jurisdiction. But getting back to a point that we were making earlier, it does also show how hard it is to do away with a sanctions program once one started. I mean, I don't think there was any dispute among the Biden administration that this was a stupid program that never should have been issued in the first place. But if you read their statements, you have to look how carefully they go out of their way to say, but by doing this, we are not agreeing with the ICC's exercise of jurisdiction in the following places, which was the dispute that led to the sanctions program in the first place. And so, on an issue where there's lots of agreement about the underlying policy, is the ICC doing something that the U.S. thinks is beyond its jurisdiction? The answer was yes in the Trump administration. The answer is yes in the Biden administration. But the difference is that the Trump administration imposed sanctions for that, and the Biden administration said, no, we're going to deal with it in other ways. But even there, it was politically hard to do on an issue. I think this issue is minor enough that they were willing to take the political risk. But there's going to be other issues like, China and Hong Kong, where I think the Biden administration would not have imposed sanctions in the first place. They might have tried to look for a different tool. Maybe they would have, but but once those sanctions are there, there's just too much political heat to be taken for doing away with a program, even though it has very little chance of being successful. And so I think it's just a great example of how hard it is to undo even the most ridiculous of sanctions programs.
Yeah, I think that's all agree with all of that, and I think this one also had the added benefit of not being that politically costly and also scoring some brownie points with our allies who were deeply sort of offended and displeased with the fact that we had done this in the first instance. And so again, in the name of building bridges and sort of strengthening ties to traditional allies, this is kind of an easy one. This is sort of low-hanging fruit from that perspective. And you're right, though, it did take 2+ months, and I think was only happened last week because the court deadline was coming up, but in any event, it's now done and presumably will stay done again unless 4 years from now we're back under an administration that is ruled by a Trump acolyte who says we're going to throw sanctions at everything that we don't like anywhere around the world.
Well, on the political, just real quick on the political issue, I mean, I agree with you that this is one that seems outside of public, concern. So I doubt that they'll pay a political price. But boy, you could see, a very Machiavellian ad maker who runs the ad that says, Joe Biden allowed some bureaucrat in Brussels to throw U.S. troops in jail by, taking this
Right.
sort of action. And so
Yeah,
I think there
that's
is some
fair.
political risk to it.
That's fair. That's absolutely fair. I could totally see that. And, come summer of 2024, we may see that ad, and it's going to be your fault for suggesting it. Um, be that as it may, I think you're
I,
right. The,
I'm
the, the
I'm
cost
guessing there
benefit
were
here,
others who would have come up with that ad.
yeah, the cost benefit here, though, I think is kind of it makes it somewhat of a no-brainer. And so I think, now that this one's done, and presumably this is could very well be the last time we ever talk about the ICC sanctions program. So goodbye and good riddance from that perspective. And with that, we're sailing along here. We're on our final topic of the day. I'm going to kick it back to Tim so that we can talk briefly about our recent OFAC enforcement action. As he alluded to earlier, an Italian company called Nordgas.
Italian company called Nordgas was hit with a $950,000 penalty. It agreed to that in a settlement that was announced on March 26th. As I mentioned, it was a case involving the Iranian sanctions, where Nordgas, which is a company in Italy that produces and sells components for gas boiler systems, it makes air pressure switches, and it sold 27 air pressure switches to Iran after purchasing them from the U.S. I think the OFAC found the conduct here to be egregious. I think what they found to be egregious about it was that in 2010, the Italian company called the U.S. Manufacturer and told them that what they were going to do with the air pressure switches, and the U.S. manufacturer said, no, we can't have anything to do with air pressure switches being re-exported to Iran. That would be illegal. And so 2 years later, Nordgas calls back and says, well, we'd like those air pressure switches and we're going to re-export them to some company in Italy. There was a discussion about, well, why don't we just deliver them to that company in Italy and save you the hassle of having to get them and then send them there yourself? Nordgas said, no, hold on, just send them to us and we'll take some action with them. And the action that they took with them was to re-export them to Iran, which is what they had originally told the U.S. company they were going to do in the first place. And so those were 27 violations of the Iran sanctions, one for each air pressure switch. The under the OFAC penalty calculations, the fine would have been quite substantial, but it came down to 950,000, 650,000 of which was suspended, assuming that Nordgas completes its compliance commitments, which are similar to the compliance commitments that we have been seeing relatively frequently from OFAC. The interesting, I found the compliance considerations discussion of this quite interesting, in part for the way that OFAC framed some of the risks. And so I did want to quickly touch on all of those. I mean, this action, according to OFAC, demonstrates the risks that foreign companies assume when involving U.S. persons and goods procured from the United States and dealing with U.S. sanctions jurisdictions and entities. Foreign companies involved in such trade should understand OFAC's prohibitions can extend not to just U.S. persons, but to their foreign trading activities as well. Obfuscating the involvement of a sanctioned country or a person in a transaction by falsifying the names of end users or other parties does not insulate either U.S. or foreign persons from potential liability. I mean, I think these are principles that are known quite well to us, but I also think these are principles that we see in our practice are not known as well overseas. And so I think what OFAC was getting at here was, if you are sitting in Italy dealing with Iran, you might think that your conduct has nothing to do with the U.S., but if you're buying goods from the United States, the U.S. keeps jurisdiction over this sort of thing. The other item that I found relatively interesting here is the discussion of a foreign company's risk-based compliance program for U.S. sanctions, and there was some emphasis on this. And so, OFAC has done a series of OFAC compliance commitments. I think those were mostly engaged at U.S. companies where there is a U.S. nexus, but I think this emphasizes that foreign companies really ought to be paying attention to these principles too. And maybe there's some modification since they are not a U.S. company, but they are going to need an effective compliance program, one that really looks at what sales and other personnel are doing with respect to their products and whether or not there is enough of a U.S. nexus that the U.S. sanctions are applicable to the conduct.
Yeah, I just have two comments to add really. One is sort of what Tim started talking about, and I'll take the flip side, which is not only from the European or the non-US perspective, but from the US perspective, because as we know, the scenario, if wearing the hat of counselor to US company, or if you are sitting at a US company, the concern, the issue, and what keeps you up at night is that you're dealing with a client or a customer in a foreign country who's telling you that they're going to use your goods for one thing and they're lying to you. And that's essentially what happened here, right? Is that the US company, the supplier, was lied to. And how how much how many red flags have to be there that you perhaps miss, or maybe there weren't any in this case, for you to be on the hook for that. as well, because technically it is a violation for the U.S. supplier here. Now, they are not part of this, and to our knowledge, they were not assessed a penalty on their own because they are essentially the victim here because they were lied to by their foreign customer. But that's always the concern, obviously, is how much, if we miss something, when are we going to be on the hook, and are we going to be paying a big penalty here if we allow our items to go to Italy that then get re-exported to Iran? And how much, when should we know? When is the known or should have known? When does it become should have known, right? That's a very difficult compliance question that we get all the time in terms of assessing red flags, in terms of getting end user certifications and things of that sort. What's enough? There's no check the box approach. It is a holistic risk-based approach that you have to take. We say this all the time. OFAC says this all the time. And that's this one, I think, really drives that home. The second point that I want to make is the penalty. It is interesting to me that it is so light, quite frankly, because they are called out here. Norgas is called out for willful violations. I mean, this is potentially criminal conduct that we're talking about here. These were willful violations. They understood that they couldn't take these items and send them to Iran, and yet they are being, as Tim said, the base penalty amount was pretty substantial. It was over $7 million. The amount of goods that were at issue here was also pretty substantial. It was $2.5 million roughly, and they're going to end up paying, if they comply with their obligations under the settlement, $300,000 penalty, and that's it. Now they have a 5-year obligation to provide annual reporting to OFAC, which is pretty significant, is going to be a significant cost, and perhaps that's how the math was done, is to say, well, look, if they have to do this and they have to invest in that and they have to have their own internal people and outside consultants and lawyers helping them with that, then that is probably worth more, that they will spend more than they would pay to us in a penalty, and so let's do it that way. But we don't see this approach very often, where there's going to be a sort of a forgiveness of a penalty, a portion of a penalty with respect to OFAC. So I thought that was kind of interesting, just something to kind of keep in mind and to look for in the future. Not that Tim and I are not on the record as asking for or suggesting that any good companies out there deserve greater penalties, or obviously we're in the business of doing the opposite and trying to advocate for lesser penalties or no penalties for our clients. But it's sort of an interesting approach that was taken here.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things on that, because that both points are really very interesting. So on the first point, given that it is a should have known standard, and again, I don't know who the U.S. company was, and I doubt that, given the explanation, that
We'll ever
anything
know.
happened
Yeah.
to them, and that we'll ever
Yeah.
know who they are. But under a should have known standard, the Nordgas told this U.S. company that they were going to reship to Iran. That's red flag number one, right? And the U.S. company did exactly what it should have by saying, no, we can't do that. So that was good. They handled that red flag correctly, but it's still there when they're dealing with Nordgas again. So then, red flag number two for the U.S. company, I think, was the U.S. company offered to ship the goods directly to the end user, and Nordgas rebuffed the offer, claiming logistical concerns. That's pretty odd, right? Because you knew that they wanted to ship to Iran originally. Then they claimed that they didn't, and you said, "Well, why don't you let us ship straight to the end user?" And they said, "No, no, no, we'll do it ourselves." And then the third red flag, which I have to say, if the U.S. company were to get in trouble, this would be the one that I think would probably push them over the edge. Apparently, Nordgas employees requested that the U.S. company remove the term "Made in USA" from the switches. And so those three red flags were red flags that a U.S. company, from the U.S. compliance perspective, would have to deal with in a situation like this, and failing to catch those could arguably have gotten them into some significant trouble. Even though it's clear that Nordgas was the real wrongdoer here, because Nordgas is the one that is going out of its way willfully to try and conceal the final destination of these products as going to Iran. And they did a number of other things that the U.S. company wouldn't have had insight into. Just using code words, using deceptive replacement terms for Iran in correspondence and trade documentation with the company. So it really was the Nordgas that was engaged in the most willful and problematic conduct. But under a should have known standard, just looking at it quickly, you can count at least three red flags that, from the U.S. perspective, that they probably, certainly on the remove the made in the USA label, probably could have done better on. And so it is a real dangerous situation when you're shipping overseas, especially after that first, once the your trade partner mentions one time we're going to reship to Iran. At that point, I think you've got to be on real guard with respect to what's happening. And then I think on the point with respect to cutting down the penalty, I mean, I think it's a very good one. I mean, I think the lawyers for Nordgas did a very nice job in getting a settlement that was well below what I think, given the conduct here, you would reasonably expect in a case like this one.
Yeah, I agree with that. And reiterate what Tim said. I think these are for compliance pros out there. I mean, these are red flag. These are right out of the red flag playbook, right? So you want to study this one and make sure that your training and your people are well aware of these types of activities to the extent that they're not already incorporated into any kind of training or internal controls, because I think these are all pretty textbook. So with that, we will. That is our final lightning round topic. We made it through quite a bit in pretty efficient fashion today. So I think that is all we have for this episode. We will be back in. So this will be up sort of middle of the first week of April. We will be back again in 2 weeks with our next episode. I think TBD what we'll be covering the next time around, whether we'll be having guests, etc. But as Tim said at the outset, we're with springtime, with some springtime holidays past us here, I think we're all um, again feeling optimistic, feeling hopeful that indirect and direct talks can yield some progress on the JCPOA 2.0 front, and we will keep a close watch on all of this going forward. So with that, Tim, any last thoughts?
No, I think we got through a lot today, and I think there were some themes that kept coming through on all of these. I think there was an Iran theme and a theme about whether or not sanctions should have been imposed in the first place that I think we'll keep coming back to.
Agree. And hopefully by the next time we record, the Washington's Major League Baseball team will have played its first game. That we can only hope that'll be the case. Otherwise, it'll have the ignominious benefit of being the first undefeated team to never play a game in Major League Baseball history, which hopefully will not happen. So
I am
we got our
hoping that
fingers crossed on that one as well.
by the time this podcast is up, Washington is either playing or is about to play its first game.
Yeah,
The
agreed. For
first
those
one
of
in
you
front of
outside the United
fans since the World Series.
That's right. And for those of you outside the United States, forgive us, silly Americans, for talking about baseball, but Tim and I both love baseball and we love the Nationals. So it is sad to see them not have played a game yet because of COVID concerns. But we hope everybody's well and gets well soon, and they're back on the field soon. So with that, we will wrap up for this week. Thank you all for joining. Until next time, stay sanctions free.
Stay sanctions free, everybody. Stay safe.